In the 20th century, some chose to appease murderous dictators whose threats were allowed to grow into genocide and global war. In this century, when evil men plot chemical, biological, and nuclear terror, a policy of appeasement could bring destruction of a kind never before seen on this earth.
Neville Chamberlain. An Examination of Appeasement. February 26, 2021. On March 17, 2003, President George W. Bush addressed the nation. His goal was to garner support for the invasion of Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. Near the conclusion of the short speech, Bush referenced the failed policy of appeasement, saying, "In the 20th century, some chose to appease murderous dictators, whose threats were allowed to grow into genocide and global war. In this century, when evil men plot chemical, biological, and nuclear terror, a policy of appeasement could bring the destruction of a kind never seen on this earth." The mantra, "We cannot repeat the Munich Agreement of 1938, was not a new policy, rather the standing policy of the United States. The policy was both stated and inferred by members of Congress, State and Defense Department, Pentagon officials, and most notably, by presidents, both Democrat and Republican. Starting with President Truman, to justify the Korean War, he stated, "Communism was acting in Korea just as Hitler and the Japanese had acted 10, 15, 20 years earlier." President Kennedy told the nation, "1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked, ultimately leads to war." From the Vietnam War, President Johnson stated, "Everything I knew about history told me that if I got out of Vietnam and let Ho Chi Minh run through the streets of Saigon, then I'd be doing exactly what Chamberlain did." President Nixon stated, "What had been true of the betrayal of Czechoslovakia to Hitler in 1938 was no less true of the betrayal of South Vietnam to the communists advocated by many in 1965. As justification for the incursion of Grenada and Nicaragua, President Reagan reminded America, "One of the great tragedies of this century was that it was only after the balance of power was allowed to erode and a ruthless adversary, Adolf Hitler, deliberately weighed the risks and decided to strike that the importance of a strong defense was realized." Before the Gulf War, President G.H.W. Bush stated, "If history teaches anything, it is that we must resist aggression, or it will destroy our freedoms." Appeasement does not work. As was the case in the 1930s, we see in Saddam Hussein an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors. In justifying our involvement in Kosovo, President Clinton said, "What if someone had listened to Winston Churchill and stood up to Adolf Hitler earlier?" Appeasement, cowardice, and Neville Chamberlain have become intertwined and a part of the national lexicon. However, the no appeasement policy has been selectively applied. An example of this is the Czechoslovakia Revolution for Reform, 1968, which tried to oust the communist leadership. The Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, invaded Czechoslovakia on August 20, 1968, to enforce communist rule. The no appeasement crowd stood by and did little more than grumble. This is the same piece of land that Chamberlain gave away in Munich. Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian general and military theorist, is primarily known for his theories of warfare. His book on war, published in 1832, is still considered relevant and considered one of the preeminent works about warfare. Clausewitz's work is studied in military and non-military universities around the world. One of the main points Clausewitz put forward is the paradoxical trinity. He writes, "The first of these three phases concern more the people, the second, more the general and his army, the third, more the government. The passions which break forth in war must already have a latent existence in the peoples. The range which the display of courage and talents shall get in the realm of probabilities and of chance depends on the particular characteristics of the general and his army, but the political objects belong to the government alone." In this, Clausewitz lays out the three necessary components needed to go to war. The question then becomes, using the requirements set forth by Clausewitz, could Great Britain have effectively engaged in a war with Germany at the time of the Munich Pact? Throughout the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century, Neville Chamberlain has been vilified for his use of appeasement rather than aggression before World War II. Aggression, however, requires the ability to engage in total war. This entails the support of the people, military readiness, economic ability, and political will. At the time of the Munich Pact, Chamberlain was lacking in all four categories. Even before World War II was over, historians began to frame the appeasement question and found the most convenient target in Prime Minister Chamberlain. In 1940, Frank Owen, Michael Foot, and Peter Howard published a scathing reproach of Chamberlain and his ministers with the book Guilty Men. Released in July, only 1 month after the disastrous full-scale retreat of the British forces from the continent. They asked, who, then, was responsible? It was not Mr. Churchill. Sir Roger Keyes spoke in the debate. He told us that, in his opinion, and he was sure it was the opinion of the whole service, if Mr. Churchill had been in office before the war, there would have been no question of any unreadiness in the forces. It is human nature to blame someone, and guilty men provided them with a target. Prime Minister Churchill, after the war, wrote his version of history, and his part in it reinforced the views set forth by guilty men. Famously saying, "The partition of Czechoslovakia under pressure from England and France amounts to the complete surrender of the Western democracies to the Nazi threat of force. Such a collapse will bring peace or security neither to England nor to France. On the contrary, it will place these two nations in an ever weaker and more dangerous situation." Churchill's representation became the standard point of view for historians until some dissent started in the 1960s. Historians started to look at the events in Munich in a broader context, pointing to the limitations that Chamberlain was working with. These include, in the international arena, American isolationism policy, mistrust of the Soviet Union, and the questionability of the Army of France. On the national level, Chamberlain was faced with a lack of military preparedness and a national hope for peace. Revisionist historians pointed out that as Chamberlain arrived home after Munich, he was met by cheering crowds declaring, "Peace for our time," and was ushered to Buckingham Palace and brought out onto the balcony with King George IV. This kind of support by the king was unprecedented, as it is the policy of the monarchy to remain neutral in political affairs. It also was pointed out that England, in 1938, would have probably had to stand alone. Even her commonwealths such as Canada, Australia, and South Africa would not engage in another war. They also looked at the logistics of the people. Although planning had started for the evacuation and/or relocation of the more vulnerable people of London, the government was not prepared. Another key point in defense of Chamberlain was the orientation of the military. Britain, a naval superpower, was never in doubt. However, Czechoslovakia was landlocked. This then meant that Britain would have to deploy land forces that were limited in both men and equipment. There is no doubt that Chamberlain's desire for peace influenced his decisions. Chamberlain was idealistic and was outmaneuvered by the Führer and National Socialist Germany. Chamberlain's private papers tell another story. As early as 1934, he noted in his diary, "Force is the only thing Germans understand. What does not satisfy me is that we do not shape our foreign policy accordingly." The question of appeasement in context to Munich and Chamberlain is still a topic of much contention amongst historians. However, the predominant view is still to blame Chamberlain. This may be in part an unwillingness to go against Churchill, who stood up to Hitler and brilliantly led Britain through the war. Treaty of Versailles. On the 28th of June 1919, after months of negotiating, the Allied powers brought the German delegation to the table, and with a metaphorical gun to the head was told to sign a treaty that would mark the end of the Great War. This treaty was known as the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty represented 32 countries. However, the majority of decisions were made by what became known as the Big Four, consisting of Georges Clemenceau of France, Lloyd George of Britain, Vittorio Emanuele Orlando of Italy, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. The result was a punitive and draconian document. Although knowing it to be a falsehood, Germany was forced to accept the blame for the war. Article 231. The Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. Adding to this, Germany was forced to surrender land and territory, much of which was occupied by German citizens. Article 84 states. Article 84. German nationals habitually resident in any of the territories recognized as forming part of the Czechoslovak state will obtain Czechoslovak nationality ipso facto and lose their German nationality. The treaty received a mixed reception around the world. In America, Congress refused to ratify the treaty and never joined the League of Nations. In Great Britain, opinion was changing thanks to books like The Defeat in the Victory by George Davis Heron, 1924. Heron and others like him started to point to the harsh treatment of the German people. The confiscation of land and resources would guarantee German economic failure. This in turn meant the default of war repetitions. However, the most troubling was that over 6 million Germans were now forced to become citizens of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. With the Germans humiliated and in economic ruin, it is reasonable to understand the rise of the nationalist government in Germany. When Hitler took the Rhineland, only a few raised concerns in England. The consensus was that Germany should have the right to self-determination. Lebensraum. Lebensraum, territory believed, especially by Nazis, to be necessary for national existence or economic self-sufficiency. One of the key platforms of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazis, was the concept of Lebensraum, put forward by Hitler. For him, it simply meant living space. He would often argue the Treaty of Versailles unjustly restricted land necessary to feed a growing German population. In his book Mein Kampf, he writes, "He who would live must fight. He who does not wish to fight in this world, where permanent struggle is the law of life, has not the right to exist." In this simple statement he is telling the world his intentions. It is also the foundation of the case against Chamberlain and appeasement. Had the world leaders taken Hitler at his word, millions of lives could have been saved. It all seems quite damning. Rudolf Binion in his article Hitler's Concept of Lebensraum, the psychological basis states that his idea was that history is basically a life and death struggle among peoples for feeding ground. Already in the early 1920s, Hitler complained a couple of times in passing that the Versailles Treaty had deprived Germany of the land needed to feed her growing population. Few in Europe took note. Politics have not changed, and what politician keeps their word? Was it more likely that Hitler was just playing to his base? Was it not just a few years earlier that English leader promised to squeeze the Germans until the pip squeaks? Hyperbole is the way of politics. Few took Hitler at his word and fewer saw the death he would bring. When Hitler ordered troops into the Rhineland, the English people did not give it much thought or concern. The land was rightfully German, and the people who lived in the Rhineland spoke German. It seemed only fair and not worth a drop of English blood. Then Germany rolled into Austria. Here again, Hitler was unifying the German people. So as Chamberlain met with Hitler in Munich, he was reassured that Germany only wanted to repatriate the German people of the Sudetenland. Chamberlain saw a chance for peace and took it. Munich. The meeting in Munich presented Chamberlain with few options, all of them bad. In his paper, Munich's Lessons Reconsidered, Dr. Robert J. Beck makes the case for the Trinity and the limitations Chamberlain had. Following the release in the late 1960s and the 1970s of public record office documents and of the private papers of many of Britain's defense planners, historians have produced multiplicity of detailed studies of the interwar period. Using a number of different approaches, they have focused upon a wide variety of factors influencing the diplomacy of Munich, Britain's declining role in the international system, the British tradition of appeasement, other important policy makers besides Chamberlain, the defense posture of Britain, the Dominions, the Far East, the Anglo-American relationship, the Soviet Union, the Treasury, British intelligence, and the press and public opinion. There is no doubt that Chamberlain wanted to avoid war. He was clear and open about striving for peace. There also can be no doubting that Hitler took advantage of this stance at Munich. This is a vital argument for the advocates of anti-appeasement and the foolishness of Chamberlain. The problem with this argument is that it does not take into account the realities of the situation. Chamberlain did not have the same power that Hitler had. Hitler held dictatorial power. Chamberlain was a prime minister of a parliamentary monarchy and as such was answerable to the people, the government, and the corporation of the military. At the time of Munch, he was listening to his military and governmental advisers. Perhaps most importantly, Chamberlain's position reflected the will of the people. On September 27, 1938, Chamberlain addressed the people saying, "First of all, I must say something to those who have written to my wife or myself in these last weeks to tell us of the gratitude for my efforts and to assure us of their prayers for my success. Most of these letters have come from women, mothers, or sisters of our own countrymen. But there are countless others besides, from France, from Belgium, from Italy, even from Germany, and it has been heartbreaking to read of the growing anxiety they reveal and their intense relief when they thought, too soon, that the danger of war was past. If I felt my responsibility heavy before, to read such letters has made it seem almost overwhelming. How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. It seems still more impossible that a quarrel which has already been settled in principle should be the subject of war. It is hard to find fault with a man who seeks peace over war and who cares enough for his countrymen and women to not throw them to the wolves. Hindsight, however, tells a different tale. That said, Chamberlain did not have the luxury of hindsight. He had only the prospect of dead countrymen and a nation under siege. The government had been developing a London evacuation plan prior to the meeting in Munich. The evacuation was primarily targeted to protect children by relocating them to areas less likely to be bombed. Unfortunately, this was still in the planning phase and the infrastructure was not completed. As Chamberlain sat with Hitler, the British government was beginning to prepare for war, however, not yet prepared. Neville Chamberlain. Arthur Neville Chamberlain, the 18th of March 1869 to the 9th of November 1940, Fellow of the Royal Society, Conservative Party, served as Prime Minister, 5 1937-5 1940. Son of Joseph Chamberlain, Mayor of Birmingham. First educated by his sister Beatrice and later at Mason College. Chamberlain entered public life as a local politician, becoming Lord Mayor of Birmingham in 1915. Chamberlain worked his way through the ranks up to Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is the second highest post in Great Britain. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, he oversaw the economy, and widely credited for pulling England out of the Great Slump, the British equivalent to the American Depression. At this time, it is noteworthy that Chamberlain and Churchill worked well together for the common goal of economic recovery. The Great War, now known as World War I, had all but bankrupted Great Britain. It is a falsehood that war is good for the economy. Although true for the United States, this is an outlier only because of the continent's immense natural resources and geographic location. Both Great Britain and France carried an enormous amount of debt after the Great War. The lion's share of it was owed to the United States. Chamberlain became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom on 28 May 1937 and left the office to Winston Churchill on 10 May 1940. Although the book Guilty Men was intended to be an indictment against Chamberlain, even they had to encourage that he was not blind to the reality that Hitler intended to make war on Europe. In Chapter IX, Umbrella Debate, they note. But the extraordinary feature of the Munich debate was this. Although the Prime Minister, on his return from the last visit to Germany, had told the listening earth as he waved his little piece of paper in the air, "This is peace in our time," the main discussion in Parliament became directed to the issue of rearmament. On this point, the whole House was united. Mr. Churchill marched in step with Mr. Chamberlain. Mr. Attlee and Mr. Duff Cooper and the whole crowd of them lined up with the government. There was a unanimous and spontaneous viewpoint, expressed the most vigorously by those men who voiced loudly the opinion that peace in our time was a reality, and not an old man's dream, that Britain must now rearm day and night, night and day. Mr. Chamberlain said in the Munich debate, "We must renew our determination to fill up the deficiencies that yet remain in our armaments." Chamberlain was no fool, nor was he under any delusions that Hitler was anything but a despot. So why then the Munich Agreement? One could look to President Reagan's statement, "Trust but verify." Chamberlain worked for the best possible outcome, however, prepared for the worst. Chamberlain had been instrumental in Britain's recovery, and therefore, knew better than most what could be achieved with another year of preparations. English factories were in the process of ramping up the production of fighter planes Hurricane and Spitfire, playing a key role in the defense of the English homeland during the Battle of Britain. July, October 1940. Without the support of Britain's fighter planes, it is unlikely that the British Empire would have lasted the first year of the war. Churchill. Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, the 30th of November 1874 to the 24th of January 1965, First Lord of the Admiralty, Prime Minister, 1940-1945 and 1951-1955. It is said of Churchill, he has 100 ideas a day, of which at least 4 are good. This quote is credited to several different people and changes a bit, however, the sentiment stays the same. This, nevertheless, sums Churchill up rather well. It is hard to imagine World War II without Churchill. It could also be argued that without his leadership the war would have been lost. One only needs to look at Dunkirk for evidence of this. A man of lesser conviction would have bowed the overwhelming opinion to sue for peace. It would not be hyperbolic to say Churchill was the linchpin and for a time the only one standing against Hitler. All which Churchill was happy to point out in his recollection of the war years. It is also fitting to point out that Churchill was a high-born English gentleman and as such he saw the world through the filter of English dominance as most of his contemporaries did. Unlike the prevailing image of the reserved and polite English gentleman, Churchill was outspoken, bombastic, narcissistic, and a bully. It seems that those traits were a good fit to lead the country through the Second World War. However, in the years leading up to the war, Churchill had no political loyalty as he was known for jumping party whenever it suited him. By the mid to late 1930s, Churchill found himself isolated and ostracized. No one was listening to him about Hitler or anything else. Churchill was the product of the Edwardian era and as such should be judged within that context. The problem lies in the prevailing attitude of the era, that being the divine right of an imperial empire. As such, it is not surprising when one comes across a memo from Churchill at the time was the Minister for War and Air in 1919. I cannot understand this squeamishness about the use of gas. I am strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. By 1919 every Englishman would have had a clear understanding of how devastating and cruel the use of chemical weapons was. In this same line of thinking, he recommended that Gandhi should be allowed to starve to death, saying, Gandhi should not be released on the account of a mere threat of fasting. We should be rid of a bad man and an enemy of the empire if he died. Yet another time speaking of Gandhi, it is alarming and nauseating to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir, an itinerant Hindu ascetic or wonder worker, striding half-naked up the steps of the vice-regal palace. To the question of why didn't Chamberlain listen to Churchill about Hitler? The answer is when one conflates Gandhi with Hitler, advocates the use of chemical weapons on uncivilized tribes, credibility becomes an issue. Paradoxical Trinity. The People. On October 6, 1938, in a speech to the House of Commons to address the criticism of the Munich Pact, Chamberlain said, Since I first went to Bixgaden more than 20,000 letters and telegrams have come to number 10, Downing Street. Of course, I have been able to look at a tiny fraction of them, but I have seen enough to know that the people who wrote did not feel that they had such a cause for which to fight, if they were asked to go to war so that the Sudeten Germans might not join the Reich. That is how they are feeling. That is my answer to those who say that we should have told Germany weeks ago that, if her army crossed the border of Czechoslovakia, we should be at war with her. We had no treaty obligations and no legal obligations to Czechoslovakia, and if we had said that we feel that we should have received no support from the people of this country. The 20th century brought several changes to Europe. One of the most unique was the consent of the people governed. Throughout most of its history, decisions go to war were made at the highest level, that of the monarch, parliamentary monarch, or emperor. When Clausewitz introduced the concept of the people, it was a radical and relatively new idea and ties in with another new concepts of nationalism and self-determination. After the Treaty of Versailles, the general feeling in England was that Germany got what it deserved. However, it did not take long before the attitudes began to change. In 1919, author John Maynard Keynes, best known for Keynesian economics, published the book The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Keynes had been a delegate of the British Treasury at Versailles. He left the conference in a protest calling the treaty a Carthaginian peace. This references the total ruin of Carthage by the Romans. Keynes's book became a global bestseller and considered to be influential in changing both public opinion and governmental policies in the English-speaking world. Keynes's key point is that Germany would not be able to fulfill the draconian measures forced upon them and that the treaty would force economic crises throughout Europe. When Chamberlain returned from Munich, he was met at the airport by cheering crowds and standing in front of the plane he told the crowd, "We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister, have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for our two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries, and we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference, and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe." Claiming peace in our time, he was whisked away to Buckingham Palace and a meeting with the king. At which point they walked Chamberlain out on the balcony to be greeted by a sea of well-wishers grateful for the peace. This show of support from the king was unprecedented. It was the policy of the monarchy to remain neutral, showing no favoritism to any political party or leader. This act alone showed that the people, and the government, would not support the war at the time of Munich. In the Great War, the British people had incurred over 700,000 war dead, and 1,600,000 wounded less than 20 years earlier. The people of Britain had no taste or any desire for war. This combined with the change in attitude towards Germany. The consensus that Germany was only taking land that was rightful theirs or occupied by disenfranchised German citizens. The alternative is inconceivable. Had Chamberlain told the country we are at war, it would likely have been his last days in office. Applying Clausewitz's Trinity, the people would not have been behind going to war. Paradoxical Trinity. The military. Although guilty men repeatedly criticized Chamberlain and his cabinet, they still admitted lack of readiness of the military, saying, although the Prime Minister, on his return from the last visit to Germany, had told the listening earth as he waved his little piece of paper in the air, "This is peace in our time," the main discussion in Parliament became directed to the issue of rearmament. On this point, the whole House was united. Mr. Churchill marched in step with Mr. Chamberlain. Mr. Attlee and Mr. Duff Cooper and the whole crowd of them lined up with the government. There was a unanimous and spontaneous viewpoint, expressed the most vigorously by those men who voiced loudly the opinion that peace in our time was a reality, and not an old man's dream, that Britain must now rearm day and night, night and day. At the time of Munich, Chamberlain had already instituted a rearmament program that included new aircraft factories. By the time war broke out, Britain's aircraft output exceeded that of Germany. The time between Munich and war allowed Chamberlain to transform the RAF from squadrons, primarily of biplanes, to a modern air force of Spitfires and Hurricanes. The manager in charge of Spitfire production, Dennis Webb, wrote, "Chamberlain's despised scrap of paper gave us a good return." The army post-World War I operated primarily with the colonies and had no real presence on the European continent. Had Chamberlain ordered the British military into Czechoslovakia, it would have created an almost insurmountable obstacle of logistics. Czechoslovakia is a landlocked country, therefore naval transportation could only help in getting troops onto the continent. Once on the continent, the army would have to travel by train through countries that at the time wished to stay neutral or wished to avoid confrontation with Germany. If one is to concede that Britain had managed to overcome the transportation issues, then there is still the problem of safe transport. The next problem is manpower, and in 1938 Britain had not instituted conscription. As a result, the standing army of England would have been insufficient to stand against a German assault. Once the British army was engaged with Germany, they would also have to contend with Italy and Japan. At the request of Chamberlain, the chiefs of staff submitted a report that determined, in the world situation today, it seems to us that if a struggle were to take place, it is more than probable that both Italy and Japan would seize the opportunity to further their ends, and that in consequence, the problem we have to envision is not that of a limited European war only, but of a world war. The counterargument is that France would have come to Britain's aid. To this, it must be recognized that it was France that had a treaty with Czechoslovakia, whereas Britain had no such treaty. France, with the largest standing army on the continent, chose to do nothing and refused to live up to their treaty with Czechoslovakia. The reality of a war with Germany in 1938 was of Britain standing alone in a multi-front campaign with an undermanned army and outdated armaments, the RAF consisting of primary biplanes, and the fight would be out of the reach of Britain's greatest military asset, the Navy. The military falls short of the requirements of the Trinity. Paradoxical Trinity. The Government 1938. The long-standing British appeasement policy of Germany started in 1929 and was the result of the changing attitude and perception of World War I. The government and the people began to question why they fought in the war. It was not clear what was won. Being that the House of Commons reflected the sentiment of the people, the consensus going into the 1930s was that of non-interference in Europe. Britain's economy was still struggling, and the government was far more focused on interior policies than international ones. What time Britain spent on international affairs was primarily their colonies. India was becoming an ongoing problem. Appeasement was also not unique to Britain. France actively pursued the policy. The United States non-interventionism and countries that called themselves neutral or were also practiced a form of appeasement. Before World War II, the term appeasement represent a legitimate form of governing and a tool for solving international disagreements. Geoffrey Record, author of Appeasement Reconsidered, investigating the mythology of the 1930s, noted that an oft-cited case of successful appeasement was Britain's appeasement of the United States from 1896 to 1903.29. By the 1890s, the number and power of Britain's potential enemies were growing. Britain had no great power allies and faced rising imperial challenges from Germany and Russia, on top of continuing traditional tensions with France and the United States. Tensions with an industrially expanding Germany became especially acute when Berlin in 1898 decided to challenge British naval supremacy in European waters. Accordingly, Britain decided to reduce the potential demands on its military power by resolving its outstanding disputes with the United States, specifically by meeting American demands that Britain explicitly accept the Monroe Doctrine, submit British Guiana's border dispute with Venezuela to international arbitration, agree to U.S. construction, operation, and fortification of an interoceanic canal through Central America, and settle an Alaskan-Canadian border dispute in Washington's favor. The British policy of appeasement was used as a tool to settle both long-term and short-term goals. With this, a tried, true, and traditional approach to governing appeasement was entrenched as Chamberlain became Prime Minister. This thought does not absolve Chamberlain, it is incumbent upon a leader to lead. It does, however, establish precedent. Applying Clausewitz' standard, political objects belong to the government alone. What then were the objectives? Britain did not seek to invade and hold German land or territories. As previously stated, Britain had no treaty with Czechoslovakia, therefore, no political objective concerning the country other than the want for peace. As to international political support for interfering with German expansion, it was almost not existent. France, with its large standing army and extensive defenses, had no intention of taking any offensive action. France had constructed a defensive line along the eastern border based primarily on the experience of the previous war. At the time of Munich, France was content to watch and wait. Chamberlain saw that France was willing to break its treaty with Czechoslovakia and had no reason to believe that France would honor its treaty with Great Britain. The Soviet Union had its agenda and was problematic. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, was playing a wait-and-see game. To Stalin, there was no upside in supporting the capitalist countries of Western Europe. The British government vehemently opposed communism and did not trust Stalin. Less than a year later, on August 23, 1939, Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact. This cleared the way for Germany to invade Poland. In June of 1941, Hitler would break this agreement as well by invading the Soviet Union. President Wilson left France with the hope of having the Treaty of Versailles ratified by the Senate and to begin helping to establish the League of Nations. Unfortunately for Wilson, he found an uncooperative Republican Party that refused the treaty and blocked entry into the League of Nations. Although the First World War made the United States a world power, the country had little interest in world affairs. At the time of Munich, the United States was firmly isolationist. Robert Beck points out, Would the traditionally isolationist United States remain aloof? This was certainly Chamberlain's expectation. Or would it support Britain, either directly or indirectly? The answer came on September 19 when Franklin D. Roosevelt met with Sir Ronald Lindsay, British ambassador in Washington. 73 at the meeting, so secret that not even the State Department knew of it, President Roosevelt articulated his awkward position. While he personally opposed Hitler and his Third Reich, the American people remained strongly isolationist. He was far from optimistic about the immediate future. If there were war, he anticipated that the Allies might be defeated. On August 31, 1935, Congress had passed the first of several neutrality acts prohibiting the export of arms, ammunition, and implements of war. The act was adjusted in 1936, 1937, and 1939. To include restricting loans to belligerent nations and eventually allowed for cash and carry of non-military goods. The last act of 1939 removed the arms embargo and allowed for the sale of arms under cash and carry. The United States would be no help to Chamberlain at the time of Munich. It was also unclear as to the support of the independent countries that were still part of the British Commonwealth, such as Canada and Australia. Traditionally, these countries would come to the aid of Great Britain. However, they also lost their sons to the Great War and had no real desire to re-engage in another war. In the case of Australia, it was keeping a nervous eye on Japan. This would have made it difficult for Britain to convince them to deplete their national defense to engage in Europe. As to the British colonies such as South Africa and India, they were striving for independence and had no love for the British government and would have likely refused any request for men to fight. With all the restrictions on the British government, what could have been done to stop Hitler from invading Czechoslovakia? It is easy to criticize the government's policies when you are the political outsider, as Churchill was. It is much harder to govern when faced with the realities of one's situation. With the full knowledge of his limitations, Chamberlain found the best peace he could. By the standard of Clausewitz, the government did not have a clear political objective, therefore does not meet the requirements. Conclusion. As it is in most cases, to summarize an event such as Munich, and lay the blame of appeasement on Chamberlain's shoulders with a one-sentence justification for war is misleading at best. In his book, 1984, George Orwell explains a fundamental truth: who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. It must be emphasized that this work does not pass judgment on the legitimacy of past military engagements. Rather, it is intended to call into question the way such engagements have been justified. Churchill, without question, should be credited with the masterful way by which he conducted the British war effort. This by no means makes the man infallible. Chamberlain, by the same token, does not deserve the derision heaped upon him. This was a man who inherited the long-standing policy of appeasement. He faced a problem with little to no tools at his disposal. Looking at Chamberlain and casting blame is missing the larger picture. The reality is that had he wanted to fight Hitler, it is difficult to imagine how. He would have had to fight a three-front war with no supply lines, limited transportation, a small and out-of-date air force, and an undermanned army. The people of England and the extended British Empire were still recovering from the Great War. One would be hard-pressed to find a citizen who had not lost a loved one or was taking care of a returned soldier with a severe disability. It was not uncommon to see a war veteran on the streets of London exhibiting symptoms of shell shock. England, a traditional sea power, had no real means of standing up to Germany at the time of Munich. Czechoslovakia is a landlocked country. Had Chamberlain ordered troops into the country, it is doubtful that the military could have complied with the order. Soldiers and materials would have had to be brought in by train. Given the time it would take to mobilize the troops, which did not exist at the time, Germany would have already occupied the country and had an open supply line back to the homeland as well as the Czechoslovakian armament. Chamberlain also knew that he would not have a support within his government had he chosen to stand against Hitler. It is a real possibility that he would have been ousted from his position and forced to resign. It is reasonable to believe that Chamberlain understood this as he sat with Hitler in Munich. Leaders in Western Europe and American presidents have repeatedly incorporated the values of appeasement into speeches and declarations. Churchill and Roosevelt are credited with keeping Europe free. To this point, it should be asked, After the war, did the average man in Poland or any Eastern Bloc country believe they were truly free? When countries must build walls and fences to keep their people in and the secret police can bust down doors, detain an individual without due process, there is no freedom. Churchill and Roosevelt rid the world from the tyranny of fascism only to have it replaced with the tyranny of communism. How is this not appeasing Stalin? On August 4, 2016, CNN reported, the Obama administration secretly arranged a plane delivery of $400 million in cash on the same day Iran released 4 American prisoners and formally implemented the nuclear deal, U.S. officials confirmed Wednesday. On February 20, 2014, the Russian armed forces seized a part of the Ukrainian territory, the Crimean Peninsula. Ukraine was and is allied with the West. The Russian armed forces are still there. These are examples of the American government using appeasement rather than force. Appeasement has become a pejorative term meant to show weakness. As such, when a president says we will not be the weak, we won't appease, it is meant to play to the nationalistic pride. However, when it is necessary to sell appeasement to the people, synonyms like concession, mollification, or conciliation are used. Whatever it is called, it is a tool that has been and is used by the American government. In the years following World War II, American servicemen have been in harm's way for approximately half of that time, and every major conflict was preceded by a president that reminded the people of the lessons of the past. This is a lesson that is misleading at the least. Based on the limitations of the military, and the will of the people. Bibliography.